On U.S. immigration, let's get to our panel. Joining us from Minneapolis is Oscar Chacon. He's the co-founder and executive director of Alianza Americas. Here in the studio is Sarah Pierce. She is a policy analyst for the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. From Berkeley, California, Prerna Lal is an immigration attorney and the founder of DreamACTivist, an online advocacy network led by undocumented youth. And Lester Munson is a principal with International BGR Group, a government relations firm right here in Washington, D.C. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Oscar Chacon, let me start with you. As we've just heard, the president is proposing a change in rules for those seeking asylum here in the United States. In essence, those seeking asylum will have to apply for it in the first country that they reach, that they enter. What kind of impact will that have?
It's going to be terrible for people trying to seek safety, especially in the United States of America, which happens to be the one country where most Central Americans have a relative. So whenever they have to face the sad reality of fleeing their countries, they, of course, want to be in a country where they know somebody, and that country happens to be the U.S. And I have to say, personally, for me, this is almost like a total deja vu going back 40 years ago, because in the 1980s, the U.S. didn't change the rules on asylum the way they are pretending to do it now. But back then, in the 1980s, when many people like me came to this country, we actually were applying for asylum, and the rate of denial of asylum applications back then was over 90% for people from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. And so in many ways, it's sad. I mean, to see that here we are 40 years later, rather than changing the rules on asylum, we are actually closing the door. That's essentially what we are doing.
Sarah, I would imagine that the United States is a signatory to international treaties, international obligations. U.S. federal law as well obligates the country to assess the validity of an asylum application. So looking at what the administration is trying to do now, is it legal?
That's the question that we'll find out in the weeks to come. Yeah. The administration is arguing that it is legal because they're still offering these individuals who are subject to the new regulation something called withholding of removal. It's a really difficult benefit to get. You have to prove that you're more likely than not to face persecution in your home country. And then even if you get it, you only have a temporary promise not to be deported and a temporary opportunity to apply for work authorization. So they are offering this very difficult, very legal benefit, and they're arguing that doing so fulfills their international obligations.
So at present, Sarah, what is the procedure? If someone enters the United States, seeks asylum, they can stay until their asylum hearing?
Pretty much. They're subject to a preliminary interview. Most people pass that interview. Then their file is handed over to our immigration court system, which is quite backlogged. So they usually wait in the United States for a period of years, waiting to go before an immigration judge and apply for asylum.
Lester, the American Civil Liberties Union has weighed in on this, and this is what their response to what the Trump administration is trying to do. This is how they responded. They said, the administration is trying to unilaterally reverse our country's legal and moral obligation to protect those fleeing danger. This new rule is patently unlawful, and we will sue swiftly. Does the ACLU have a point there?
Well, they may, and that's the role of the courts, is to handle this kind of discrepancy between judgments about policy in a certain regard. But I think it's ignoring the fact that there's a real political conundrum in the U.S. right now. There's the country is evenly divided on this question. There's a lot of folks who want to see a much tighter immigration policy at the border. Those are mostly Republicans. Democrats want to see a much looser policy on the border. There's a real political battle going on, and there's been no real movement in the political branches of our government to resolve that. There hasn't been any kind of compromise. Folks aren't working together to actually solve this problem.
But what about the actual change that Trump is proposing, Lester? The fact that, a person who wants to seek asylum has to do it in the first country they enter.
Well, I don't know that that's a terrible idea. I think it needs to be sorted out. I do know that the refugee flows are greater than they have been recently from Central America. I think the U.S. needs a better foreign policy towards Central American countries. The administration recently announced it was cutting off a certain amount of foreign assistance to those countries. I don't think that was a terrific decision at all. I think there needs to be a real hard look by Washington at countries in Central America. What is the U.S. role there? Are we stabilizing things? Are we promoting democracy and human rights? And are we making those countries more livable for the people who live there? Because I think ultimately folks don't necessarily want to leave their homeland to go anywhere, much less, the bad immigration situation in the United States. We should do what we can to fix things in Central America.
All right, let me bring in Prerna Lal. She joins us from California. And Prerna Lal, the immigration courts, as Oscar just reminded us a moment ago, they're backlogged. There's more than 800,000 cases awaiting adjudication right now. It'll probably take years for those cases to be heard, to be processed. What needs to be done to get that logjam moving?
That's a great question. The immigration courts have been backlogged for years now, and the situation is only getting worse. One thing to do that is humanitarian would be to ensure that people who are seeking asylum, who are escaping to save their lives in this country, are not detained for months and weeks and years, actually, on end, while their cases are pending. And there are legal mechanisms in place to ensure that these persons are allowed to be out of jail or detention facilities in order to pursue their asylum claims, because it's also makes more sense in terms of due process to allow people to present their asylum claims while they're not behind bars or in camps in terrible conditions.
Oscar Chacon, talking about conditions under which the migrants are being held, the United States Vice President Mike Pence, he went down to the border, got a first-hand look at one of the border detention centers on Friday. This particular center had 400 men in it, crammed behind a fence. It was in a room. The smell there was described as overwhelming. Here's what the Vice President had to say right down there. Let's watch.
You saw a temporary facility that was constructed because this facility is overcrowded. And we can't keep people in a cell beyond what the rules and regulations allow for. But everyone, even in that temporary facility, Pamela, is getting 3 meals a day, they're getting health care, they're getting hygiene, and the Customs and Border Protection is doing their level best in an overcrowded environment and a difficult environment to address this issue. But Congress has got to act to make it possible for us to reduce the numbers of people coming into our country illegally.
So, Oscar, there's been a lot of controversy over the administration's detention policies at the border. What did you make of what the Vice President said there?
Well, I think he's trying to put the best face possible on a reality that indeed is very systemic. This administration has been absolutely relentless in pursuing a policy that in the end seeks to basically block anybody, especially from countries like Mexico, Central American countries, to ever reach the U.S. and do so in a way that is respectful to the law. I definitely believe that the conditions that have been created in the border are part of a game plan that essentially is seeking to mobilize the most ardent supporters of the president in their hope to be able to get him reelected in 2020. I also believe that the visit by the Vice President is intended to essentially put some seeds on the ground for what's coming next, which is going to be an incredibly ambitious request, budgetary request, so that they can get far more money from the U.S. Congress, that is taxpayers' money, to basically pay for even more enforcement than we have seen so far. In the end, I am very convinced that this administration is pursuing essentially a very racist approach to immigration policy. Let's remember that these are countries that we have actually had a part in making them so unlivable as they are today, and that hardly any one of them can really be described fairly as a safe country, let alone a place where people want to be in.
Lester, what's your response to that this is political in general and about the next election in particular?
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting point, because I think if you look back at 2018, President Trump tried to make immigration the hot issue before that election. For about a month or two before the actual voting day in November, he was talking about caravans coming up from Central America. He really tried to beat the drums on the immigration issue and drive out his base, and it failed miserably. Republicans got swamped in the House. They barely picked up a seat in the Senate where they should have done better. The Republicans lost in that election in 2018. And I think if he's going to make the issue the main thing again in 2020, he's not going to win. This is not a winner of general elections. It's not a good move.
But clearly the advice he's getting, Lester, points to the fact that this is the winner for me.
Well, I think he can't help. I don't want to speculate about why the president does it. It's possible he just wants to dominate the headlines, and he really doesn't like it when the stories about Democrats fighting with each other over their various issues. He wants to be involved. He wants to be part of the story. He wants the top 5 stories in the news to all be about him. So he does have kind of a nose for the spotlight, and maybe it's as simple as that.
Sarah, what do you make of the way the migrants are being treated at the border? I mean, does the government have any, I guess, legal obligation to treat detainees in a certain way?
So, I mean, what's happening at the southern border is that this administration is sincerely being overwhelmed by a sincere crisis, right? We're seeing more asylum seekers at our southern border than we ever have before. The problem is the administration isn't stepping up to increase resources at the southern border or to speed up the asylum adjudication so we can move people through faster. And so those two things are meeting, and we're just having people held at facilities that were never meant to hold people for long periods of time.
Right. Oscar, I heard you there. You wanted to say something?
No, I think that it is important to set the record straight. There has been plenty of news stories that paint the number of people arriving as unprecedented, and that is factually not true. If we go back to the 1980s and the 1990s, we will find at least 2 moments in that period of time when the arrivals to the borders number over 1.6 million people. So it is not factually accurate to say that we are being overwhelmed with unprecedented numbers. This is a manufactured crisis. The president is making this into a crisis, and rather than addressing the real source of the problem, which is what is happening in Honduras, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, he's making it into a crisis at the border of his own making. So I think that it is important to have the numbers and the record straight on that particular subject matter.
I was careful to say that it's unprecedented numbers of asylum seekers at the southern border. He's totally right. 1.6 million.
Sarah, I'm not sure that that's actually accurate either.
Well, when we had 1.6 million arrivals in the year 2000, it was largely single adults, largely from Mexico, who were quickly turned around and deported. Right now, with these numbers, the people who are applying for asylum and largely families and unaccompanied children who are arriving at the southern border, the procedures are far different. Instead, we have to process their claims. We have to do a lot. It's a lot more resource intensive for the U.S. government, where when it was 1.6 million individuals, we had far less people working on the southern border, but because of the nature of that flow, we were able to turn them around quite quickly. So because it's specifically asylum seekers, it's definitely a different resource challenge for the U.S. government.
Lester, the White House...
But I think you are right.
Go ahead, Oscar.
I was just going to say that Sarah is correct. I mean, that the number of people seeking asylum today is probably larger than it was before. But let's remember, back in the 1980s and even in the early 1990s, there was a very different landscape in as far as the laws in place. So in many ways, I insist, I mean, this is a largely manufactured crisis because of our own negligence in as far as modernizing the systems of humanitarian protection that should be protecting the people fleeing from Central America, and simply they aren't.
Lester, the White House is blaming Congress for what is going on right now, for this crisis. And this is what the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham had to say. Let's watch this.
We're going to change our asylum law that you have to apply in your home country or Mexico. No longer do you come here. We're going to give the people in charge of this process more than 20 days to handle a claim. We're going to hire 500 more judges to get through the million-person backlog. And we're going to let everybody know that don't give smugglers money anymore, because you're not going to wind up in the United States like you used to. And what have I learned on this trip? If we pass the bill we've introduced in committee, 90% of this goes away.
90% of this goes away, Lester. Do you agree?
Well, I don't know if it's 90% goes away. He's not making bad points at all. We need more resources. We need more of the resources that he described. He was down there with the vice president. He saw a lot of the real problems, and if we saw any of the video, you realize that there is a crisis. We need more resources down there. It's just not terrific conditions at all for the folks who have come across the border, and we need to do a better job. I think he's admitting that. As the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, he plays a key role in this, so I take heart that he's looking at a pragmatic solution. And I also think, Senator Graham, he's actually been a leader on these issues. He's looked for compromise in the past. I hope that his counterparts in the other party are willing to work with him on finding a solution.
Prerna Lal, what did you make of those suggestions that the senator made there?
Well, I tend to believe that the crisis is really manufactured by the Trump administration, as Oscar said. I think there's a very simple solution that the U.S. has always exercised in terms of giving credible fear interviews and then to the asylum seekers and then having them show up in court, because most of them actually do show up in court because they have credible asylum claims. And if they're presented by a lawyer, they can actually, for the most part, the majority of people actually win their asylum claims. So this whole crisis of detaining people and the fact that has led to many migrant deaths in terrible conditions, and then trying to have asylum seekers remain in Mexico is also causing so many different problems. I mean, these are all manufactured crises that then the Trump administration is saying, look, we need more resources to enforce the law. The law is that asylum is legal, that seeking asylum at the border or wherever, however you enter the country, is the law. And to not abide by the law, the Trump administration is in mass violation of so many different U.S. laws as well as international law.
Prerna, there is another group that is facing a lot of uncertainty under this administration, and that is the so-called dreamers. These are undocumented migrants who came to this country as children. That case is now before the U.S. Supreme Court. What's at issue here, and how will that be resolved?
Well, I mean, I can't predict how the Supreme Court is going to resolve the issue of undocumented young people who are brought here by their children, by their parents. I mean, yes, there's been years of uncertainty around what is called the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which allows at least about 800,000 people the right to live and work in the U.S. temporarily. And this program was initiated by Obama and is still in place, even though Trump has tried to end it many times. So, I mean, the matter will definitely be resolved by the Supreme Court, hopefully, and set the stage really for the next elections, I think.
All right, Oscar, let's get back to what's going on right now. The Trump administration threatened raids over this weekend. As far as we know, not much of that took place, although the president says different. We talked with one undocumented migrant in Chicago. Our reporter Dan Williams talked to this migrant. Let's listen to what she said.
I have 6 kids, all U.S. citizens, and I'm afraid that one day I get pulled over too and be the same way as my husband. I'm afraid that I can go to the store and not come back.
So, Oscar, this is the second time the president has done this, threatened raids, which apparently have not taken place. So what do you think is his motivation behind this?
Fear. To put it in one word, I mean, the president is absolutely betting on the fact that if he can keep saying, however exaggerated it may be, that he's going to unleash the immigration police, known as ICE, to go after people who are in this country either with a pending deportation order or simply undocumented in the U.S., that somehow that will cause so much fear that some people will decide to actually self-deport. Remember that the notion of self-deportation has been actually in the mind of many politicians over many years. The reality is this is also part of the effort by the administration to create evidence that they need more human resource to be able to actually pull off a deportation of the kind that the president has spoken about. I definitely believe that it is important to keep in mind that on a daily basis, nearly 400 people have been actually put in detention because of immigration violations. Largely, what I mean by that is people in the U.S. without a visa. And this is the current capacity of ICE, the immigration police. They surely would want to get more resources to be able to do far more than that. But what is causing right now is fear and uncertainty in people like the lady you were interviewing in Chicago, my home city.
Sarah, many of the families and individuals targeted by these raids say that they've received no documents. They've not been served with any kind of deportation orders of any kind. Do they have any legal recourse, or are all their, I guess, legal options now exhausted?
No, if they can show that they were never given notice of their hearings, they can file what's called a motion to reopen those proceedings and argue that. And I do think that that was a big issue with this group. According to reports, the individuals who were supposed to be targeted in these raids were on what's called rocket dockets, so accelerated immigration court dockets, in which they quickly had hearings. And if they didn't know about those hearings, if the notice never showed up, they were issued removal orders in absentia, so without being present in the court.
Lester, what do you make of these threats to carry out these raids? I mean, it's the first time I've heard of police essentially announcing that they're making a raid.
Well, and it's odd in other ways too. They announced they're going to do these raids, and then the raids didn't really happen. It appears that the president, I think, is trying to find a way to make news and be the, kind of be the alpha actor here and be the person who's really driving the coverage, even if it's somewhat negative on other issues, because he's a little bit vulnerable on this issue. He campaigned originally in 2016 about building a wall on the border. That really hasn't materialized yet. If anything, the immigration issues have gotten more severe in the U.S., between the U.S. and Mexico and Central America, so he hasn't really solved the problem either. He's got to make it look like he's doing things. And so my guess is that this announcement and then lack of follow-through is more about him trying to make it look like he's doing things to address a problem.
And Sarah, the other issue is that it seems that ICE, the main agency implementing these directives, is not always right. The Cato Institute published a report which said that from 2006, that's going way back to 2006, to 2017, ICE agents wrongfully detained more than 3,500 U.S. citizens on immigration charges in Texas, just in one state. From 2017 to 2019, ICE imprisoned almost 500 citizens on immigration offenses in Florida. How does that happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's operational problems on the ground. But I do think it's important to remember, like Lester was saying, I think that this was mostly a strategy of deterrence related to the crisis at the southern border, because they were specifically aiming at families who had recently got removal orders on those rocket dockets that I mentioned earlier. So rather than being a part of ICE's normal enforcement agenda, this was specifically aimed at recent arrivals, mostly Central Americans, to try to deter future asylum seekers from coming to the southern border.
Oscar, I've just got a few minutes left, a few seconds rather, and I just want to address this issue. And the number of people taken into custody at the U.S. border has fallen by 28% since in June. That's after Mexico agreed to deploy its National Guard at the southern border. That's a significant drop. So in that instance, is the Trump policy working?
Well, frankly, let's remember that every year during the summer months, the hottest months, there is always a significant decrease in the number of people arriving at the U.S. border. But it is important not to downplay the role of Mexico. Mexico has, for all practical purposes, become the extended U.S. border. And this is not just from a month ago. This goes back actually to the year 2014, when President Obama sought precisely greater collaboration from Mexico, and we did see a reduction in the number of people arriving to our own border. But if you look at the number of people arrested and deported from the Mexico-Guatemala border, you will find a very close correlation in the numbers. So clearly, these are factors that are playing into it. But the last thing I'll say is enforcement in the way this administration is carrying out has proven over the last 30 years to simply be a waste of resources, because it doesn't address the critical question of why are people fleeing.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.